again, we have this vague kind of Thomism here. The sin is usury. The main vehicle for the concentration of wealth in our society is usury. This is strangling the economy. It's debt that is strangling the economy because everybody's in debt. And the first thing you have to pay off every month is your debt, because otherwise they'll repossess your car or they'll kick you out of your house or whatever. That's the main problem. And the main problem, again, is that the church is not proclaiming the teaching on usury. Now, I went to Rome. I went to the Vatican. I had lunch with a member of the Secretary of State there in the Vatican. And I said, there are three areas where the church is not proclaiming the gospel: church, state, the Jews, and usury. And he said to me, well, forget. And I said, what about John Courtney Murray? He didn't know who John Courtney Murray was. Okay, forget about that. We're not going to talk. The Jews, this Pope's not going to do anything about the Jews. But usury, that's a good idea. So send me something, and I'll put it in the next encyclical, which is what he did. It's in Laudate Si. My part of the book come from Barren Metal about debt and strangling the economy. Except that I said usury and they changed to debt. But then the Pope, after going to Philadelphia, he went to New York and he said the U word in front of the United Nations. He said usury. Well, that's the first time a Pope has said that word since Rerum Novarum, which ends on the term rapacious usury. So that's good. I feel really optimistic. And then something happened. The Jesuits took over the papacy. And
from the book, this is on page 245, and it popped out at me because you referenced Charlemagne, which I'm a big fan of Charlemagne. Quote, in 812, Charlemagne tried to codify this arrangement in his book Capitulare de Villis, which became the model for arranging occupations on the large estates left over from Roman times. In each royal estate, provision was made for blacksmiths, gold and silver workers, shoemakers, turners, wagon makers and carpenters, emblazoners, soap makers, brewers, bakers, and lace makers, as well as for carrying out womanly tasks like spinning, sewing, knitting, washing, and also the weaving of linen and processing of wool into cloth and other materials, and the finishing of all kinds of clothing articles. This is just meant to give folks a sense of the different guilds which existed in the Middle Ages. Talk to us, Dr. Jones, about guilds, the patrimony that labor unions today have received, and how they squandered it, if you would.
They squandered it by sin. Sin is the source of all problems. So the guilds started exploiting the apprentices. There were all kinds of complicated problems. It was basically, it was a good system, and they exploited it for their own personal benefit instead of having some sense of the common good. But the main issue here was basically the guilds got sidetracked by the factory, because the whole point of a factory is you don't need skilled workers. This was the great genius of Henry Ford, who did not invent the automobile. He invented the assembly line, which is basically you don't need a big training period. You just walk in off the street and we'll give you a wrench and you turn that bolt, that nut, and that's it. And then the thing moves on. So at this point, you've lost control of the means of production, which the guilds had at a certain point. And so you've lost your leverage with the larger economy. And at this point, you've got to come up with a way of enhancing your collective bargaining power when you're bargaining for wages. And that means unions. Now, the union was completely powerless because as soon as you go on strike, you get fired and they hire scabs. And so the big breakthrough was the sit-down strike at the Dodge, Maine, in the 20th century in Detroit. We're basically, okay, we're going on strike, but we're not leaving the factory. Sorry. And you're not going to produce anything until you come to your senses. And Henry Ford hated unions. Okay, he was a man who understood the importance of the family wage, raised wages, was a genius in that regard, but he hated unions and had to die before the Ford Motor Company could come to grips with unions, which his grandson did in 1947 when he actually sat down with the UAW. Henry Ford's way of dealing with Walter Reuther was to have his goons beat him up. And Walter Reuther got beaten up, and you can see pictures of him with bruises all over his face. His grandson was smarter, largely because of Catholic influence, not just on him, but on the culture at large. This is the fruit of Quadragesimo Anno in particular, but also Rerum Novarum, which said basically you have to treat these workers they have rights. You can't ignore their rights. They have to be able to have a family and prosper in that regard.
Dr. E. Michael Jones, so glad to have you with us. Those are the foundational Catholic principles that I wanted to cover before we can kind of deep dive into the book. I'm going to be reading some passages from the book Barren Metal on the back end of the following break. We're back with Dr. E. Michael Jones. We're talking about this book, Barren Metal, and the subtitle is The History of Capitalism as the Conflict Between Labor and Usury. I think this is one of the most important Catholic economics and finance and banking books that is out there today. So I want to kind of get into it. I'm going to give you a quick roadmap for the second part of the show. We're going to cover pagan economics, the city of Florence, why it was so significant to the development of capitalism, the Whistle Bank and the subsequent Bank of England, the Andrew Jackson era in the United States, the potato famine in Ireland, the Federal Reserve, and then finally to encyclicals like Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno. And then we'll kind of end that section with a discussion about the 2008 financial collapse and Dr. Jones's thoughts going forward. And then on the back end of that, if there are intelligent questions in the live chat, I'll bring them in. So start thinking about what you have to ask Dr. E. Michael Jones. Okay, first part, sir. Pagan economics. Is pagan economics just slavery? And couldn't you make an argument that we're essentially back in pagan economics now?
No, it's not just slavery. It's slavery and usury. Usury drove the independent farmer class into slavery, and they ended up working up as serfs on the latifundia. So it's usury combined with slavery, which is pretty much what we have today. Yes.
The city of Florence. You spent a good deal of time talking about Florence. You've already brought it up in this interview, especially with respect to manufacturing, which the primitive manufacturing was the creation of garments. This is a pretty complex economic creation here, because you're getting wool from all parts of Europe. They're all coming in. You're manufacturing that. You can only get certain colors in certain parts of the continent. You get some colors in Germany. You get other colors in wherever else. Why is Florence so pivotal in the economic history of the West and the world?
Because it was able to make use of the human invention to basically create a system, a new economic system that was to a large extent independent of gold. Now, they had gold coins. There's no question about it. But you had, because of the wool industry, you had to have contacts with the Low Countries, and you also had to have contact with England. England was the main supplier of gold. So as of the Middle Ages, how do you do business? Well, you go to fairs, and you take a big bag of gold. Well, if you got a big bag of gold with you, guess what your problem is? You can be robbed, and you'll lose everything. So what you have to do is you have to have knights. And when the knights get to the fair, well, they got to do something. So they have jousts, and it's great. It's a great time. And we now have people who just want to recreate these things like, medieval jousting and so on and so forth. But it's not a good way of exchanging money. So basically they understood that, well, if I got a branch in Brugge, and I got a branch in Florence, let's just say, okay, let's not transfer the gold. Let's just put it in terms of bookkeeping. And this led to the rise of double entry bookkeeping, which was a great step forward in economic exchange, because you didn't have to carry bags of gold around with you. That came from Venice, by the way. We should not eliminate. I focused on Florence. Venice had another crucial role to play, which comes into play in the book when the Fuggers, go down. They went to Venice. They didn't go to Florence because Florence had been spent at that point. But Venice was still the up and coming power, a sea power that Florence could not be. But so it led to these innovations, which led to much better forms of economic exchange.
Skipping over an immense amount of time and energy that you've put into your book, just for the sake of having a productive interview that sort of gives people a sense of the book, I want to go into the fractional reserve banking, which essentially was created, as you say, by the Whistle Bank, off of which the Bank of England was modeled. On page 532, you write, quote, "At the time of its inception, the Whistle Bank was a 100% reserve bank. But at some point, probably as early as 1656, it violated that principle and began lending out deposits, in effect using the same money twice, and as a result, slipping secretly into the practice of monetary issue. In doing this, the Whistle Bank created the first significant innovation in the history of money since the 8th century BC. One thing folks may not know, Dr. Jones, is that the Bank of England is privately owned. It's not really owned by the state of England. And when we get into the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, I'm going to ask a similar line of questions. These private stockholders, are they the richest people in the world today?
Yes. Yes. Yes, you're right. The Bank of England was a Whig creation. The Whigs were the only people who owned stock in the bank, and you set yourself up in a situation. Cobbett, William Cobbett, the great chronicler of the Reformation, great, just an outstanding orator. But was the man who said basically what you did with the Bank of England is you created a situation where you have two sets of Englishmen. You have taxpayers and tax eaters. And so anytime the government went into debt, the Whigs made out like bandits because they were the ones who were lending the money. That is precisely the kind of double standard that involves us with the Fed, okay, where basically the creditors rule the entire world and everything is done for the benefit of the creditors.
What about fractional reserve banking, which they, I guess, stumbled into? Is this something that you think is contemptible, or do you think that with appropriate level of reserves that banks, should be engaging in that lending practice?
The question is it usury? Is it sinful? And again, we've got this long, complicated history of calibrating the inflation rate with the interest rate. And is it usurious or not? The church had no influence on this. So basically what you had was the spread of, so fractional reserve, is that wrong? No, that's not wrong. That's simply a way of using money effectively. Is usury wrong? Yes. So you're constantly having to bring this discussion back to the moral basis of what we're talking about here. Otherwise, you're going to end up with this materialism, which is basically what Marxism is, where property is theft. No, property isn't theft. Property is necessary. You're always trying to reduce it to some type of material manifestation when we need to talk about the moral implications, because economics is morality. Adam Smith got hired to be a professor of moral philosophy. That's how he got started. It's never going to change. All of the physicists, it became pseudo-physics. I talk about that in great detail in this thing, but it never stopped being morality. So we have to constantly ask the right questions here.
And we certainly will. In fact, I think let's just jump to the potato famine, and we'll go back to Andrew Jackson, because we're on this line of thinking, especially with the Brits and their rigid adherence to economics as a science and not as a moral sphere. You've detailed in your book how strictly the British leaders adhered to this orthodoxy of free markets, laissez-faire capitalism, ignoring the suffering of the Irish. In fact, if I can quickly get to a quote, I would love to bring this out because this is something I think people are going to be interested in, and then I'll get to the question. Here it is. So you first start off the chapter on Irish potato famine with a discussion about Malthusian theories about population growth, which the two don't seem to go along with each other. But then you sort of drive the point home when you speak about how the Brits thought of it. And here we are, page 981. The main cause of the Great Famine was not this bacteria that was killing all the potatoes, but rather English Protestantism, especially if we take capitalism as the ultimate expression of the cultural form which the Reformation had taken by the middle of the 19th century. The main cause of poverty in Ireland in the years leading up to the famine was the confiscation of Catholic land by Protestant invaders. Over the centuries following the Reformation and conquest by figures like Cromwell, the land had been stolen from the natives and distributed to English freebooters who used religious differences as an excuse to grind their Irish tenants and reduce them to a poverty so severe that it was unknown in any other part of Europe. Wherever the English ruled, markets took priority over human need during famine. Isn't that what we saw during the Irish potato famine? And we continue to see that, Dr. Jones, in the world today, that people trust markets and the orthodoxy of laissez-faire capitalism over the needs of people.
Yeah. The specific example in Ireland was basically you had people like Lord Palmerston, who they were in debt to the Jews. Every aristocratic family over the course of the 19th century, landed aristocracy fell into debt with the Jews. Okay, so because you got to pay the Jew off, you're going to grind the tenants. You got to grind them and grind them and grind them to the point where, okay, you ground them out of existence, and now nobody's going to work on your property anymore. Okay, that's the situation. So it resulted in a situation where, okay, there is food being produced in Ireland, but it's being exported at the same time that the tenants on the place producing the food are starving to death. That's sinful. That cries to heaven for vengeance. And why did they do that? Because of this economic system that markets are supposed to be supreme, and morality should not intrude into markets, creating market distortion. That, to this day, we have a figure like Tom Woods who justified price gouging, after 9/11, when the refugees from Manhattan tried to get hotel rooms in Long Island, and they're charging them $1,000 a night for a hotel room. And Tom Woods says, yeah, it's because the markets will take care of that. So what that means is they'll build more hotel rooms. Well, this is ludicrous. And this is the type of ideology, completely blind ideology, that led to the deaths of thousands and thousands of people in Ireland. The market will take care of it. Well, wait a minute. This lady died before the market could kick in. Who's going to be held responsible for that? This is a complete and total abuse of the notion of property, that you have an absolute right to property. If people are starving to death, you do not have that absolute right. And secondly, the idol known as the market, which is terms like God as the replacement for divine providence, or more importantly, human charity.
Yeah, one would have to seriously wonder if the Irish were good Anglicans, whether or not the Protestant Brits would have allowed them to starve. But to your point,
that is true. They ground their own workers too. Okay, so let's be fair here. Okay, it was Cobbett who said this phony-ass mania for ending slavery was basically simply a recognition that chattel slavery cost more than Irish day laborers. And Cobbett said that Wilberforce is interested in the blacks in the slave ship, but he's not interested in the worker at the bottom of the mines, who could have been English or.
To your point about the price gouging in Manhattan post 9/11, we just saw that as well in the state of Texas. They had a big ice storm, Dr. Jones, and then some, because power, to heat your house is free floats and on a market rate, some people were being hit with $1,000 a day bills. And there are some laissez-faire free marketers who think that is okay.
Yeah, I'm sure Tom Woods was right up there justifying that. I apologize.
Very good. Dr. Jones, I want to go. We skipped over, I think, an important topic, because one of the people that we tend to lionize in the United States as a warrior for, against the central bank is Andrew Jackson. And I want to read not only a quote from your book, I want to read another quote from another book, and try to understand where our minds need to be on this issue. So I think I'll start with from the Creature from Jekyll Island, an incredible seminal work on the history of the Federal Reserve. And on page 348, here's how he describes Andrew Jackson's policy towards the second U.S. bank. Quote, Jackson decided to place his entire political career on the line for this one issue, and with perhaps the most passionate message ever delivered to Congress by any president, before or since, he vetoed the measure. The president's biographer, Robert Remini, says, quote, the veto message hit the nation like a tornado, for it was not only cited constitutional arguments against recharter, supposedly the only reason for resorting to veto, but political, social, economic, and nationalistic reasons as well. Jackson devoted most of his veto message to three general topics. First, the injustice that is inherent in granting government-sponsored monopoly to the bank. Second, the unconstitutionality of the bank, even if it were not unjust. Third, the danger to the country in having the bank heavily dominated by foreign investors. Now, in this book, we sort of get the idea that Andrew Jackson is a hero, somebody who has an acute and piercing understanding of the banking system. When I read your treatment of Jackson in Barren Metal, here's what you say, Doctor. Quote, Andrew Jackson, who, as a result of the Allison affair, had sworn revenge on a financial system he never understood, but the immediate cause of Jackson's hostility was his suspicion that the Bank of the U.S., which he characterized as a vast electioneering engine, had used bank money, which is to say the money of the people of the United States, in an attempt to defeat him in the election of 1828. In addition to being vindictive, Andrew Jackson had an acute sense of what was politically possible and what was not. As a result, he entered office ill-disposed toward the bank, but amenable to suggestions. That amenability disappeared when Biddle responded disproportionately to Jackson's attack. And if you don't know who Biddle is, you could read the book. But Biddle retaliated by cutting off credit and calling on loans, creating financial panic. He unwittingly substantiated all the claims that Jackson had been making for years, and public opinion slided inexorably in Jackson's direction. By calling down Armageddon on the entire country, Biddle played right into Jackson's hands. All right, so two questions on this, Doctor. First, do you think it's possible that the author of The Creature of Jekyll Island may have is just lionizing Jackson because he hates the central bank so much that he just wants to read a hero into it? Or do you think that he's just totally off base in claiming that Jackson really did understand the system that he was fighting?
I think the first is the option. When you were reading that, I couldn't help but think of Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is the Andrew Jackson of our age.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Obviously, there are different changes, but a kind of vindictive guy, a kind of guy who's out of his depth, a guy who mistakes the part for the whole. All this type of stuff is true of Andrew Jackson. So what happened is, okay, yeah, you broke the big bank. Okay, that's good. That's a good idea. But then you don't understand the root of the problem? It's usury. It's not a big bank. It's all banks. And so you broke the big bank, and then you led to the creation of all these wildcat banks all over the place. Every state, every city, you could just set up your own bank, and you start doing fractional reserve banking. Well, what do you have? You got $5.50 in your back pocket, and you're lending out thousands and thousands of dollars. Well, you're going to go bust. You're going to have a run on the bank, and that's precisely what happened across the country. And at that point, the only guy who could stop the run on the bank was J.P. Morgan, who had so many financial resources he could backstop any bank that went down. J.P. Morgan died, and at that point, these people realized, no, we had to have somebody who's going to protect us from these wildcat banks, the run on the bank, and so that allowed. So Andrew Jackson paradoxically led to the creation of the Fed. You'd think that a guy who wrote The Creature from Jekyll Island could understand that, but we're always looking for heroes. It was like Donald Trump. Everybody was trying to make Donald Trump into something that he wasn't. And, it
And just to get more specific so folks can understand your point of view, what you write about Jackson and his war on the central bank was that he really fixated on paper currency because he had personally been burned by paper currency in a bunch of land dealings that he had done. And so paradoxically, as you say, he hated the Federal Reserve because of the paper currency, not because of the usury.
Yeah, and because first of all, we have gold bugs now. Let's go back to gold because you can't have inflation. Well, first of all, you can have inflation with gold. Read the chapter on Florence, how they created that. But secondly, it's materialism. You're always trying to fixate on some material thing as the source of the problem. Just like Karl Marx, it's property, and you're not getting to the heart of the matter, which is moral.
Right. It's time, since we're talking about Andrew Jackson and the Bank of the United States, I think most Americans and folks around the world understand that it was Alexander Hamilton who created the first Bank of the United States. Jackson fought the second Bank of the United States. When you get to chapter 89 of your book on page 1221, we read about the third Bank of the United States, or in other words, called the Federal Reserve. And I just want to read a couple quotes to tee off this discussion. You say, quote, "When the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law, it was portrayed as a great victory for democratic reform over Republican special interests, a triumph for the popular will, and a defeat of Wall Street. It was, unfortunately, neither a triumph of the popular will nor a defeat for Wall Street. It was, in fact, a triumph for Wall Street that was a defeat of the popular will." You go on to say at the bottom of the page, 1221, "Now, whenever anything went wrong, the apologists for laissez-faire could blame the government, as Milton Friedman would go on to do in his analysis of the stock market crash of 1929. When the people, however, went to their elected representatives to complain about the Fed's monetary policies, they were told that the Fed was above and outside the political process. The creditor class had once again created a game in which every flip of the coin had the same result. Heads, I win. Tails, you lose." Isn't that the truth?
Yes, that's the truth. And to bring up the 1929 never should have happened. The Fed was created to prevent that type of thing from happening. And it happened in spite of that, and yet it didn't do anything. There was no substantial reform as a result of the crash of 29. Nothing happened. You had Roosevelt coming to power and introducing a kind of socialism based on what he saw happening in the Soviet Union and all. It was just the spirit of the times. All of fascism, all of Nazism, everything that happened in the 1930s was a reaction to the 1929 crash and the hegemony of what they would call the Anglo-American banking system. And there was no substantial reform. The Fed continued to exist. As I said, it was heads I win, tails you lose. Everything that happened justified the Fed. It's like wearing masks.